That man is dangerous and his animals are a menace to society. Karen shrieked into her phone, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose as police sirens painted Meadowbrook Lane in flashing red and blue. I demand you arrest him immediately. The older rancher leaned against his fence post, arms crossed, a slight smile playing on his weathered face as 3 police officers approached. The neighbors gathered on their perfect lawns, some filming with phones, others whispering behind cupped hands. Nobody expected what happened next, when the rancher calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a single folded document that made the officer step back, eyes wide with shock. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, turning to Karen with a grimace, "we need to talk about false police reports." Karen's face drained of color as the crowd fell silent. The rural reality check was just beginning. Before we start the story, please comment down from which country are you watching and don't forget to subscribe. It all started on April 3, 2025, when Margaret Wellington, known throughout Lakeside Estates as the Clipboard Queen, decided James Sawyer's 60-acre ranch was an eyesore that needed to be eliminated. The silver BMW rolled to a stop at the edge of Sawyer's property that morning, tires crunching over gravel like expensive shoes walking on potato chips. "Mr. Sawyer," she called out, her voice slicing through the peaceful morning air. "We need to discuss your situation." James looked up from the fence post he was hammering. At 62, he had the leathered face of a man who'd spent decades under the Texas sun and the patient eyes of someone who'd weathered every type of storm, both natural and human. He set down his hammer, wiped calloused hands on worn jeans, and approached the property line. "Morning, Ms. Wellington. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret's smile remained fixed as a museum display. "Mr. Sawyer, this is the 3rd notice regarding your livestock. The Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association strictly prohibits farm animals within community boundaries." James glanced over his shoulder at the 3 goats grazing peacefully beside his modest ranch house. "Those goats have been here longer than your fancy subdivision." "That's precisely the problem." Margaret's French manicured finger tapped her clipboard. "Your property may have been here first, but progress requires adaptation. The HOA covenant clearly states." "Ma'am, my deed predates your covenant by 30 years. James interrupted gently. "I've explained this before." Margaret's smile tightened. "The board meeting is tomorrow night. I strongly suggest you attend and explain why your animals, unsightly farm equipment and that." She pointed to the rusted tractor parked near his barn. "Eyesore are still visible from lakeside properties. Our home values are at stake." James took off his worn cowboy hat and wiped his brow. "I was here when this was all open country. Your houses are the newcomers, not my animals." "The board vote is already leaning toward legal action," Margaret warned, her voice dropping to a chilly whisper. "This is your final chance to comply voluntarily." James just nodded politely. "I appreciate your concern, Ms. Wellington. Have a good day now." As Margaret drove away in a cloud of dust, James watched her taillights disappear around the bend. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Hey, Mike. It's James Sawyer. Remember that conversation we had about land rights a few years back? I think I'm gonna need your help after all." Lakeside Estates wasn't always the pristine gated community with manicured lawns and coordinated mailboxes. Just 7 years ago, it had been part of Sawyer's sprawling cattle ranch, land that had been in his family for generations. James had sold a portion when medical bills piled up after his wife Sarah's cancer diagnosis. The developers promised a small, respectful community that would blend with the rural surroundings. That lasted exactly 9 months. Then came the expansion, the luxury homes, and finally Margaret Wellington from California, who took one look at the HOA bylaws and decided they needed strengthening. Within a year, she turned a casual neighborhood association into her personal kingdom, complete with color-coded violation notices and monthly compliance inspections. Sarah would have known how to handle Margaret. She'd always been the diplomatic one, smoothing rough edges with her gentle humor. But cancer took Sarah 4 years ago, leaving James alone with his memories, his animals, and 18 acres of the original ranch he'd refused to sell. The morning after Margaret's visit, James drove his old pickup truck into town. The main street of Oak Ridge hadn't changed much in 50 years. The courthouse still stood proud in the center, its limestone walls weathered but dignified. James parked in front of a modest office with Michael Harrington, attorney at law, stenciled on the glass door. Mike greeted him with a firm handshake. "James, good to see you. Coffee?" "Black as always," James nodded, settling into a worn leather chair. "So, the suburbanites are finally making their move?" Mike asked, pouring 2 mugs. "Margaret Wellington delivered another notice yesterday. Claims my animals violate some covenant I never signed. James sipped the coffee. Board meeting tonight. I figure I should know where I stand legally. Mike pulled out a thick folder. I've been expecting this. When you sold that west parcel, we added specific protections to the deed. Your property is classified as agricultural heritage land under state law. He flipped through documents. They can't force you to remove livestock agricultural equipment or change your operations. The covenant has no jurisdiction over your property. James smiled for the first time in days. That's what I thought. There's more, Mike continued, his expression serious. The development agreement they signed actually contains a binding clause about respecting adjacent agricultural operations. If they pursue this, they're the ones violating legal agreements. So what's your advice? Attend the meeting. Stay calm. Let them show their hand. Mike handed him several stamped documents. Take these. If things escalate, you have legal protection. Just don't lose your temper no matter what they say. James nodded, tucking the papers into his jacket. Never been much for shouting anyway. The Lakeside Estates Community Center gleamed with fresh paint and designer furniture. James felt distinctly out of place as he entered, still wearing his work clothes, clean but worn jeans, a pressed flannel shirt, and boots he'd quickly brushed off but couldn't completely clean. Residents filled the rows of chairs, most avoiding eye contact with him. A few nodded politely. James recognized Tom and Barbara Miller, whose property backed up to his eastern fence line. They'd always been friendly, even bringing him a pie after Sarah passed. At precisely 7 p.m., Margaret called the meeting to order, her gavel striking with unnecessary force. Before we address regular business, we have a special agenda item. Her gaze locked onto James. As many of you know, our community has been struggling with an adjacent property that refuses to comply with neighborhood standards. Murmurs rippled through the room. Mr. Sawyer's animals, equipment, and general property condition are depressing home values throughout Lakeside. Margaret clicked a remote, and photos of James's property appeared on a large screen. They were clearly taken with a telephoto lens, angles chosen to emphasize rusty farm equipment rather than his well-maintained barn or the tidy ranch house. The board proposes legal action to compel compliance with community standards, Margaret continued. We've prepared a nuisance complaint and— Excuse me, James interrupted softly. May I speak? Margaret's lips thinned. We typically hear from board members first, but since you're here, 2 minutes, Mr. Sawyer. James stood and faced the residents. I've lived on that land for 62 years. My father worked it before me and his father before him. When your developer bought the west section, specific legal protections were included in the sale. He paused, making eye contact with several residents. My property is classified as agricultural heritage land. That means your HOA has no legal authority over my animals, my equipment, or my operations. A buzz of conversation filled the room. Margaret rapped her gavel sharply. That's completely irrelevant, she snapped. Your property affects our community aesthetics and property values. James reached into his jacket and removed the documents Mike had given him. These papers say otherwise. The development agreement your HOA signed actually includes a binding clause acknowledging and respecting adjacent agricultural operations. He handed copies to the board secretary. You can verify with the county records office. Margaret's face flushed crimson. This is obstructionism. We have rights as property owners. So do I, James replied calmly. I'm not asking anything of you except to let me live as I have for decades. Barbara Miller stood up from the audience. I'd like to say something. My family and I moved here because we wanted a taste of country living. The ranch next door is part of that charm. My kids love seeing the animals. I don't understand why we're trying to force Mr. Sawyer to change his way of life. Several others nodded in agreement. Tom Miller added, our property values aren't suffering. If anything, having open space and a real working ranch nearby makes this place special. Margaret's knuckles whitened around her gavel. The board has already voted. Without consulting the full community? Barbara challenged. I don't recall seeing this on any previous agenda. The meeting dissolved into heated debate. James sat quietly, watching as the community divided before his eyes. Eventually, Margaret called for an official vote, clearly expecting her usual rubber stamp of approval. The result shocked her. 17 against legal action, 8 in favor. This is unacceptable, Margaret hissed as the meeting adjourned. Don't think this is over, Mr. Sawyer? James nodded politely. Have a good evening, Ms. Wellington. As he walked to his truck, Several neighbors approached to introduce themselves, including the Millers. "Sorry about all this," Tom said. "Most of us mind our own business." "Appreciate that," James replied. "You folks are welcome to visit the ranch anytime. Sarah, my late wife, always enjoyed having neighbors over." "We might take you up on that," Barbara smiled. "Our kids would love to see the animals up close." For the first time in months, James drove home feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. Maybe there was still room for coexistence after all. That hopeful feeling lasted exactly 3 days. James was feeding his chickens early Saturday morning when he noticed something wrong with the fence bordering lakeside estates. As he approached, his stomach tightened. Someone had cut the wire in multiple places. And his 3 goats, Daisy, Clover, and Old Billy, were nowhere to be seen. "Daisy. Clover," he called out, walking the property line. A sinking feeling told him exactly where they'd gone. His phone rang before he could even begin searching. "Your filthy animals are destroying my prize roses." Margaret's voice shattered the morning calm. "The police are on their way. This is criminal negligence." James took a deep breath. "Ms. Wellington, did someone cut my fence? How would I know how your decrepit fencing failed? But I'm documenting every bit of damage for the lawsuit." James hung up and called Mike. "They're setting you up," the lawyer said immediately. "Don't engage. I'm on my way." By the time James walked around to the lakeside entrance, a police cruiser was already parked outside Margaret's pristine colonial home. A small crowd had gathered, watching as Margaret gesticulated wildly, pointing at Daisy and Clover, who were indeed sampling her immaculate garden. Old Billy had found a shady spot under a tree and was calmly observing the chaos. Officer Jensen, whom James had known since he was a rookie, looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Morning, James," he nodded. "Got some escapees, I see." "Someone cut my fence, Ray," James said quietly. Margaret interrupted. "That's absurd. These dangerous animals broke free and invaded private property. I want him cited for destruction of property, animal negligence, and violating HOA regulations." Officer Jensen sighed. "Ms. Wellington, livestock occasionally get loose in rural areas. It happens. This isn't a rural area, it's a premium residential community." Margaret fumed. "And this man has been warned repeatedly about his animals." James whistled softly, and both Daisy and Clover immediately looked up, trotting over to him like well-trained dogs. Even old Billy heaved himself up and ambled over. "Doesn't look like dangerous animals to me," Officer Jensen observed. "Check my fence line," James suggested. "The cuts are fresh." "Preposterous." Margaret sputtered, but something in her expression flickered. Officer Jensen radioed for his partner to examine the fence. Within minutes, confirmation came through: clean cuts in multiple places, clearly deliberate. "Ms. Wellington," Officer Jensen said carefully, "making false reports is a serious matter. So is criminal property damage." "Are you accusing me of?" "I'm not accusing anyone yet," the officer interrupted. "But we take vandalism seriously." Margaret's husband Howard appeared on the porch, looking mortified. "Margaret, please, let's handle this reasonably." She whirled on him. "I am handling it. Someone needs to stand up for this community." James quietly gathered his goats' leads. "I'll fix my fence and keep them secure. Sorry for any disturbance." As he turned to leave, Margaret shouted after him, "This isn't over, Sawyer. The board will hear about this." Officer Jensen approached James privately. "You might want to consider security cameras. This could escalate." James nodded. "Already ordered some yesterday. Had a feeling." The fence-cutting incident divided Lakeside Estates even further. Many residents were horrified by what clearly appeared to be sabotage, while Margaret's close allies doubled down on complaints. Over the next 2 weeks, James installed security cameras and reinforced his fencing. He also invited several neighbor families to visit the ranch, including the Millers and their children, who delighted in feeding the chickens and petting the now famous goats. Word spread about these visits. Soon other families asked if they could come see the animals. An informal Sunday open house began drawing regular visitors. Children who had never touched a farm animal learned where eggs came from. James found himself enjoying the company, telling stories about ranch life that Sarah would have shared. Margaret watched these developments with mounting fury. Her complaints to the county fallen on deaf ears after the fence-cutting incident. Her attempts to call emergency HOA meetings were blocked when not enough board members would attend. Even her most reliable allies seemed to be distancing themselves. Then came the final straw. The Millers put up a charming wooden sign at the curve where James's property met Lakeside. Sawyer Heritage Ranch, good neighbors since 1897. Margaret snapped. On April 24, exactly 3 weeks after her first confrontation with James, she made the call that would change everything. 911, what's your emergency? I need police at Sawyer Ranch immediately. Margaret's voice trembled with manufactured fear. There's a dangerous situation with uncontrolled livestock threatening children. He has wild animals and he's threatening neighbors. Within minutes, 3 police cars roared down Meadowbrook Lane, sirens blaring. It was Saturday morning. James was hosting his now regular weekend visit for neighborhood children. About 15 kids and their parents were in the barnyard area when the police arrived. James was showing 8-year-old Emily Miller how to collect eggs when he heard the sirens. He walked calmly to his front gate, where officers were already exiting their vehicles. And there stood Margaret, pointing dramatically toward the barn. That's him. Those poor children are at risk. Officer Jensen was among the responding officers, looking extremely displeased. Ms. Wellington, you reported dangerous animals threatening children? Margaret nodded vigorously. Just look. He's running an unauthorized petting zoo without permits or safety measures. There could be diseases, injuries. The other officers surveyed the scene. Children laughing as they petted gentle goats, parents helping collect eggs, James's border collie Rusty playing fetch with 2 boys. I see a group of neighbors visiting a ranch, Officer Jensen said flatly. This is an illegal commercial operation in a residential zone. Margaret insisted. From behind the fence, Barbara Miller called out, We're just visiting our neighbor. The children are having a wonderful time. Other parents murmured agreement, looking confused by the police presence. James stood quietly, arms crossed, waiting. Officer Jensen turned to Margaret. Ms. Wellington, is this the 3rd call you've made about Mr. Sawyer in 2 weeks? Someone needs to enforce the rules. He's violating zoning ordinances, HOA regulations. Ma'am, interrupted the senior officer. False emergency calls are a criminal offense. Margaret's face flushed. This is an emergency. He's endangering. I'm going to need you to stop right there, the officer said firmly. There is clearly no emergency here. James finally spoke. Officers, I'd like to show you something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document that he'd been carrying ever since his meeting with Mike. The senior officer read it, his eyebrows rising. He passed it to Officer Jensen, whose expression shifted from annoyance to surprise. Ms. Wellington, the senior officer said, are you aware that Mr. Sawyer's property is officially designated as a historical agricultural heritage site by the state of Texas? Margaret blinked. What? No, that's impossible. This certification was issued 3 years ago, the officer continued. It gives him special protections and exemptions, including the right to host educational activities related to agricultural heritage. He's not only following the law, he's participating in a state-supported program. Let me see that. Margaret snatched the paper, scanning it frantically. This can't be legal. It has the state seal, ma'am. It's as legal as it gets. The officer turned to his colleagues. I think we're done here. Officer Jensen added, Ms. Wellington, this is your 3rd false report. I need to inform you that the next time you call emergency services without a genuine emergency, you will be cited for misuse of emergency services. The color drained from Margaret's face as she realized the situation had completely backfired. The neighbors were staring. Some were filming with their phones. Her carefully constructed authority was crumbling before her eyes. This isn't over, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. James simply tipped his hat to the officers. Appreciate you all doing your jobs. Would your kids like to come see the animals sometime? We're open weekends. The youngest officer grinned. My daughter would love that. Margaret stood frozen as the police departed without taking any action against James. The neighbors returned to their activities, some giving her a wide berth, others openly glaring. For the first time since moving to Lakeside Estates, Margaret Wellington had no audience for her performance. The aftermath spread through Lakeside Estates like wildfire. By evening, everyone had heard about Margaret's false police call and James's heritage site certification. Video clips circulated on the neighborhood chat group. Comments ranged from embarrassed to outraged, not at James but at Margaret. An emergency HOA board meeting was called the following Monday, but not by Margaret. The vice president, Howard Jenkins, presided instead. In light of recent events, he began, we need to discuss leadership of this association. Margaret sat rigid in the front row as, one by one, Neighbors spoke about the fence-cutting incident, the false police reports, and the hostile environment that had developed. Barbara Miller stood to address the group. The HOA was meant to protect our community's interests, not wage personal vendettas. Mr. Sawyer's ranch is an asset to our neighborhood, a piece of Texas heritage our children are fortunate to experience. Instead of fighting him, we should be grateful to have such a knowledgeable neighbor willing to share his way of life. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. Margaret was removed from the board by a margin of 22-3. As the meeting adjourned, she sat alone, clutching her now meaningless clipboard. Howard Jenkins approached her quietly. "Margaret, I think we need to consider whether this community is still the right fit for us." She looked up shocked. "What are you saying?" "I've been offered a position back in California. After all this, maybe it's time for a fresh start." 2 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in front of the Wellington house. The asking price was significantly lower than Margaret had once insisted the property was worth. Nobody in Lakeside Estates seemed particularly surprised or disappointed. On a warm Sunday in June, James hosted the first official Heritage Day at Sawyer Ranch. Over 50 people from Lakeside Estates and surrounding neighborhoods came to learn about traditional ranching practices, sustainable agriculture, and local history. The Millers helped organize activities for the children. Tom had discovered a talent for storytelling, recounting tales of early Texas ranching to wide-eyed kids. Barbara coordinated a schedule of volunteers to help with weekend visitors. As James watched children feeding chickens and asking questions about everything from eggs to tractors, he felt Sarah's presence stronger than he had in years. She would have loved this, the ranch full of life again, bridges built between the rural past and suburban present. "Quite a turnout," Mike Harrington commented, joining James by the fence. "Never expected anything like this," James admitted. "Started out just trying to be left alone." "Sometimes the best communities form when someone tries to break them apart," Mike observed. James nodded toward the freshly painted sign at his gate, "Sawyer Heritage Ranch, everyone welcome." "Sarah would be proud," Mike said. "She sure would." James smiled. "You know what she always used to say about city folks?" "What's that?" "They just need a little dirt under their nails to remember where they came from." As if to prove his point, 8-year-old Emily Miller ran past, her designer clothes smudged with barn dust, clutching a freshly gathered egg like it was pure gold. "Mr. Sawyer. Look what I found," she called out, beaming with pride. James knelt down to her level. "That's a perfect egg, Miss Emily. You've got a natural talent for ranching." Her face lit up with a joy no shopping mall or video game could ever provide. The simple pleasure of connection to the land, to animals, to something real and lasting. In the distance, a "sold" sticker appeared across the Wellington house sign. The new owners were a young couple with twins who had specifically mentioned the neighboring ranch as a selling point. James looked out across his land at the houses beyond his fence line, and at the people moving between these once separate worlds. The battle lines had disappeared, replaced by something neither he nor Margaret had anticipated: a genuine community. Sometimes it takes a rural reality check to remember what truly matters. Not property values or power struggles, but connection to the land and to each other. James tipped his hat to the horizon where his fence met the subdivision, no longer a boundary but a meeting place. Sarah would have liked that most of all. If you like this story, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share.